So I'm not surprised that we've ended up both sitting on the fence there when we're talking about housing associations being developers or providers. But moving on to the next subject, and you mentioned this a couple of times as well as we've just been speaking there. So the third part of the social housing September, are housing associations getting too big, and is big beautiful? And the first word that springs to mind when I think of that is politics, because if you let something get too big, you might get all these cries of, it's a monopoly, and then, things become less efficient. And of course, we've discussed that in the last two episodes, that, lack of efficiency is not a very good thing as well. But I'll leave the floor with you, Neil. What are your initial thoughts on whether housing associations are getting too big?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And one, again, I'm going to try and have a foot in both camps. So I think straight off the bat, I don't think that being a small organisation automatically means you're going to be a good organisation. Similarly, I don't think being a large organisation is going to automatically make you a bad organisation. There are arguments that potentially you get to a certain limit, and some in the sector kind of put that around 50 to 60,000, that it gets too big to manage effectively from kind of a high level point of view. But there are advantages and disadvantages of being the size that certain organisations are, but it comes down fundamentally to what your values and your strategic objectives are as an organisation. That said, there are some very good examples of where being big is not a good idea. Mentioned them before, but Clarion are an organisation that are in the news quite regularly at the moment for failures in their repairs service. And it's not necessarily to pick them out and pick on them, but they have been quite appalling. So let's use them as an example. They have over 120,000 units. They are significantly spread, but predominantly London, South and Southeast. They are an amalgamation of a number of organisations. So they went through a series of quite big mergers in order to get where they are, of organisations of similar kind of sizes. And certainly it would seem the eyes have slipped off the ball somewhere, in that they are regularly being found to have been of maladministration in terms of a judgment by the Housing Ombudsman. I'm just trying to find the right words there, but we'll go along with that. And service failure items as well. So you don't tend to have those put against you unless something quite seriously has gone wrong. Part of the social housing inquiry that is currently going on in House of Commons was as a result of some of the issues that have been raised relating to some of their stock. Quajo, who his surname eludes me, so deep apologies on that, but he's known on Twitter as Quajo Housing, who was a student whose father passed away, was living in social housing, had numerous outstanding issues with the quality of that property, has now become somewhat of a campaigner, basically embarrassing housing associations and local authorities where they are providing poor quality social housing, particularly where disrepair is an issue. So be it cockroaches, be it mold, be it water flowing through electrics, he's been out there filming it, naming and shaming. And again, this is housing associations and local authorities, so it's not just on housing associations. A number of the housing associations that he raises are quite large organisations. And what, from my personal view, you're kind of seeing is a inability to effectively manage service provision, and ineffectiveness in understanding how best to deliver services. Some of this will be historic. I think some of it's going to be system related. If you think most housing associations are small to medium enterprises, they will be using technology, particularly when it comes to the main databases for the housing information, so housing management systems, the more technical term, that don't necessarily talk to each other when you merge. This can have a load of issues in terms of how you effectively run your services. You can be concurrently using different systems, telling you different stuff if you haven't got that system right. It feels like a number are kind of hitting a level in terms of stock that they can't in fact effectively manage that, and it's becoming an issue that you can't just get round by a lot of manual work and kind of putting your nose to the grindstone. So on the one hand, I think there is an argument that some large housing associations aren't performing where they should be under the new regulatory environment. That's going to come out very clearly because they're going to have to publish performance-related information. They're going to be more susceptible to proactive regulatory intervention, which will lead to further public divulging of where they're at from an organisational point of view. But I think also we just haven't had the right people in the right positions to manage these services. Now, we're great as a sector at promoting from within. We pride ourselves in developing staff and putting time and money and effort into improving them. But sometimes you need to go out of sector in order to get the right people. And it's not that we don't, because a number of chief execs have had no experience working in the sector prior to moving over. But sometimes in kind of head of service or maybe director level, group director, we haven't quite appointed the right people, and that starts to flow through in terms of their competencies in managing a highly complex and evolving situation. That being said, being small doesn't absolve you of any of those problems. It just means they're on a smaller scale and less obvious if things go wrong. Mm-hmm. So if you have an ineffective housing service or an ineffective repairs service where you own 50 units, if things go catastrophically wrong, you have 50 units you've got a problem with. If you own 125,000 units, like more or less Clarion does, and 3% of those have gone catastrophically wrong, you're already in a much far bigger numbers game. So the likelihood of being drawn to the attention of the wider world is higher, more significant. So there could potentially be an argument that we point the finger at larger housing associations because it's easier, more likely to find failure in them than the smaller ones. But at the same time, I think there are very significant logistical system-based challenges that these organisations are facing and frankly not succeeding at, which is why we're seeing some of the net results that we are.
I think on that, first of all, kudos to that chat that's going around naming and shaming. I think that's a very important thing to do. And I'm going to put social, all housing, I'm going to put in the same conversation here, because I think it's, when you look at private landlord, road landlords as well, a lot of the sort of good law abiding, landlords, whether they're social housing, whether they're private housing, we try and do our best. We don't mind a bit of regulation. I think there's probably normally a point where there's too much regulation. I think that then, can change the dynamic. But best example I could think of is electrical safety test, periodic electrical safety test. Great idea, genius, absolute genius. Totally agree with it. Haven't got an issue with that. Thumbs up, absolutely. But sometimes it always does seem to be the case where you get all this regulation come in, and the better housing associations or private landlords, etc., try their best to keep up. But it always seems, whether it's a media thing, that when there's a slap on the wrist to be had, it's always those people that get the biggest slap on the wrist, whereas the more rogue people, businesses, seem to almost get away with a bit more. That's my perception. Is that something that you would tend to agree with from your experience, or disagree with?
It's interesting in the social housing sector. As you mentioned in the previous podcast around regulation, there are certain things that the regulator just isn't able by law to get involved with, and you would like to see. I think certainly had we been in the proactive environment that is coming from April 23, Clarion would be in deep trouble. I honestly can't see from an external point of view how they can't be. More generally, I think there is a point where people they do so much that it's almost like, well, how do you deal with it? Whereas it's easier just to get someone on a minor infringement and kind of put an enforcement notice placing. There's some very interesting research actually on the private rented sector in terms of how the experience both for landlords and for tenants can vary so drastically between local authority, because obviously regulation from the kind of enforcement point of view, policing point of view, is local authority based. There is no national body as there is for social housing. So if you live in Warwickshire, you might get one experience, where if you live in Sussex, you might get another. And, you know, certainly just from an end user point of view, that can be very frustrating. For social housing, ironically enough, even though there is a single regulator and a national one at that, you can have similar experiences. So yeah, I think it's frustrating wherever you see people not adhering to what they should be and others suffer as a consequence. And I think naturally we are sympathetic to the little guy on those things, but you'd want to see a fair application of the rules and the law as required, I guess.
Perfectly understandable. I guess, yeah, I don't have any sort of other comments apart from to waffle on. I have made a note here. Law of diminishing returns. So I'm sure you're familiar with that. And to me, that again, I think that highlights what we spoke about in the previous episode and what we'll speak about here, is that more than likely there is going to be this sweet spot of amount of units owned where, you know, that there is a number that's good. I remember ages ago, a couple of sources for private landlords was the number 19. Don't ask me how they came to that number. I do not know, but it was along the lines of, if you've got, you know, one buy-to-let, or you've got two buy-to-lets, and something does go horribly wrong in one of them, I mean, that could wipe out, you know, any profits across a whole portfolio. Whereas if you then have too many units, and again, sorry, Clarion, hopefully your legal people aren't listening to this, because probably the episode will get banned or something like that. Apologies. But if you have 125,000 units, you're going to have a lot of stuff going wrong. Whereas, again, I think they worked out a formula where 19 was a sweet spot. Anyway, by the by, law of diminishing returns. So if you, and sorry to put you on the point, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but if you, in an ideal world, what would you say from your experience would be a good number of units for a housing association to be able to, you know, effectively and efficiently manage?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I work for an organisation that had 2,500 units spread across Birmingham, and the organisation I work for now is 46 to 48,000 units spread across 100 or more local authorities. What I remember from working in the former is that you were always doing multiple jobs and you were always scrabbling around, and no one was truly an expert. I mean, they were very smart, knowledgeable people and good at their job, but you had to have many hats on. I mean, my first job in the sector was as a business improvement and communications officer. In layperson's terms, I was undertaking service area reviews. I was leading the complaints service, but I was also writing the staff newsletter, updating the website, and helping create content for the annual report. Which, you know, great, because your Monday, your Tuesday, your Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday were completely different, but it's kind of an example of the multitude of roles that you need to do. I think you do need a certain level of size to enable specialism. With specialism comes enhanced competency. It's not that someone who is doing multiple things can't be competent, they very much can, but it enables you to have a greater focus on what you need to deliver and potentially deliver it more effectively. It also shelters you from worse storms, as you mentioned earlier. You know, if you've got a couple of units and one of them goes sideways, well, then that's potentially you done as a business. Whereas if you can spread the risk, you've got more of an opportunity to ride out any individual issues that occur. and this is purely a gut feel, but somewhere circa 50 to 60,000 units does feel like the right balance of size, scope, connectivity to locales, and ability to do your job. The sector does have to provide value for money assessments each year. We have certain metrics that we have to submit to the regulator on, just to show where we are, and nominally kind of show, who the better, the more efficient performing organisations are. It always comes out as a bit of a mixed picture, because depending on the nature of stock, it has a massive impact. Again, the organisation I work for first, a large amount of their stock was pre-Victorian, pre-1910, not pre-Victorian, so was Victorian, which meant you spent a significant amount of money on repairs and maintenance, because they absolutely, weed out heat. They were paying to maintain. For some reason, the procurement structures previously was just buy what was ever in, so you had no consistency or efficiencies on your stock, because you could have one block with 4 different types of toilet cistern in it. All these nightmares that you have in terms of being efficient. But it didn't do anything crazy in terms of development. It wasn't just burning cash left, right, and centre on frivolous things. It just had a deeply costly stock profile. So there are external factors that can impact. Now you could say, well, they could just sell that stock and move elsewhere. But if most of your stock is of a profile, and it means you've drawn from the localities that you want to operate, which are core to you as a business, well, to some extent, to intents and purposes, you kind of have to take that on the chin. So it can be a complex picture. But you do see the bigger errors coming through with those who are in 90 to 120,000. Again, whether that's just because of the law of averages, or whether it's because they are genuinely not efficiently and effectively run and governable in the way that smaller organisations are. Can't quite tell, but certainly 50 to 60,000 feels like a good cap.
Just a little anecdote, we were talking about old Victorian properties. I remember someone ages ago saying to me that they're built so well, which is true. They're saying to me that they're built so well that even the Wi-Fi has to knock to ask if it can go into the room next door, just because of how built like a brick house.
They are solid, yes, very solid.
Yeah. Absolutely. So somewhere around 50 to 60,000 would probably be the ideal number. We also established that you do have your bigger housing associations out there, and they're in hot water potentially moving forward, but you could also be in equally as hot of water, even if you only got a few units at the other end of the scale. And really, there's a law of diminishing returns there. And also, like what you said about specialisation, Adam Smith was the first thing that comes to my mind. Wealth of Nations, the old pin example of pinheads and all that sort of stuff. So there are elements there. Just tackling the second part of the question, it is big, beautiful. I mean, that can mean a multitude of things to a multitude of people. And I'll drop you in here. You're the one that suggested that question. So what do you mean by is big, beautiful?
I think the key thing here is understanding, is being big central to your aims? So if you see your aim as, going back to the other episode, are you a developer or provider? If one of your core aims is to develop and to build as much social housing as you physically can per year, grinding through, whilst having a slightly stripped back service offer, if that is beautiful to you, then, in the eye of the beholder, great, that's not a problem at all. If beautiful to you is having really locally focused, grounded organisations where you are central to that community, almost becoming another arm of the welfare state, which frankly, because of some of the reforms that have happened over the last decade or so, has been the case for a number of organisations. then your priority probably isn't building as many units as it is. It might be to build a few, might be to acquire a few, but actually you're going to shift your investment into that local community. So it'll be providing employment support services, mental health services, soft skills training, debt and management advice services. That would be your core. So in that instance, big would not be beautiful. So it's a lovely catch-all phrase just to say that just as beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so is whether or not being a big organisation or a small organisation is. So it's quite a nice term. It's one that sadly I didn't coin in terms of the sector. It's been used for a while, but I do quite like it as a phrase. It covers a number of sins.
It's certainly fair to say that it's a good conversation piece as well, because it will, spark debates and whatnot. Going back to then the first part of the question, which is, are housing associations getting too big? I must admit, before we started recording, I would have said no, that I don't think they're coming too big. But actually, having spent the last bit of time with you, I'd be inclined to change my mind on that and say, are they becoming too big? Yes, possibly. But then the devil's advocate on that, and it's just typical fence sitting. I'm sorry, I am sorry. The typical fence sitting is actually there's nothing wrong with being too big, because if you're being run properly and you're adhering to everything that you need to adhere to, and everything's running like clockwork. I appreciate that doesn't happen 100% of the time, but let's just say, most things are tickety-boo, then actually there's nothing wrong with being the biggest housing association in England, because if everything's being run properly, happy days.
Yeah, well, 100%. Certainly the approach I kind of had, which doesn't always endear me to everyone, but I think, if you're well run, size is immaterial. The issue is that the bigger you are and the worse that you run, the bigger impact you're going to have on people. So that is where we have an issue. I think probably part of the issues we're seeing in the sector is just the speed at which these new organisations have been created. And I would love, there was an absolutely brilliant report that came out from the Housing Corporation prior to becoming the Homes and Communities Agency, which kind of looking at mergers between organisations and their impact, which is a big part of my undergrad thesis. I can't for the love nor money find it, which really drives me nuts because it's gone to the National Archives and it's disappeared. But noticing the speed and frequency with which organisations have merged, it is definitely increased since the year 2000, quite significantly. And I think it's only ever going to go that way, realistically. So if you're seeing at the moment organisations of this size showing quite significant growing pains, because that's what largely we're talking about here, is an organisation's doubled in size and doesn't quite know its left arm from its right. It's like when you see a baby or a puppy trying to work out, oh, these are legs, what are these doing? The issue is it's not a puppy's legs that need to get themselves in order, it's a multi-billion-pound organisation that is having people with raw sewage come up their toilet, so big impact there. But you need to balance it. You need to understand, what your appetite is, but what you're able to take on. And I think some of these organisations haven't done that, and that's where I would be critical. So instead of merging with a similar size organisation, merge with someone that's a quarter your size. Manage that change, manage that growth, and then you'll be in a better position. Because I think certainly from the likes of Clarion, maybe even to a smaller extent Peabody, where you've had very similar sized organisations kind of come together to be these behemoths, you are seeing the natural aches and pains of that growth and trying to assimilate different systems, processes, HR policies, repairs policies, and fundamentally getting the data in one place where you can use it effectively to manage your processes. So yeah, I would certainly think that, as we kind of started with, being big isn't necessarily a problem. It's about being effective, and that's immaterial to size in many ways.
And that comment probably doesn't just apply to housing as well. So we've ticked a number of boxes with that. Thank you for that. That's absolutely superb. I mean, I'm sorry, I laugh about that, but actually, that's quite an interesting point on a number of spectrums, regardless. So I think that sums it up, to be fair, Neil. I have no other words to put on that. I mean, a thought that just came to mind, and I'm not going to say it's slightly off topic, but this is a question that I've just penned down. With everything that we've spoken about in the last three episodes, if you had to pinpoint maybe one or two of these, what would you say the biggest challenges that the social housing sector is facing at this current point in time?
One is the same that everyone is facing, which is inflation. So you had a number of years where the formula that dictates the rents that organisation can charge actually had a negative on it. So you had a -1% cut year on year for 4 years. That put a big hole in organisations' pockets, which they then had to reevaluate their business plans on. We're starting to see some of the impact now actually on that on service provision, although the 1% cut is now ended. We're getting to a point where we could potentially see 11% increases on social rents in the next year. Perfectly doable within the way that the formula is written. Morally, is it justifiable? Probably not. So you're probably going to see organisations try and take a hit on that. So they might try and charge 5% as opposed to 10%. Absolutely the right thing to do. Has an impact on the bottom line though. So that will see your investment programs hit. It will see your ambitions tempered. It will see your development programs drop back. At the same time, we are seeing significant bills come through quite rightly for building safety and for fire safety. Some of it will be able to recoup from the freeholders on the units that we own. Others we are going to be liable for because we are the freeholder. So you're going to see significant costs come through there. Finally, decarbonisation. Again, we have some challenging targets to hit that we need to go for. We're seeing the impact this year quite upfront and personal in terms of climate change. Again, it's the right thing to do, but there is concern at what we're going to be able to deliver as a sector given the other financial impacts. And then you have inflation itself costing us everything. Everything is going up in terms of costs. So you are seeing a significant amount of inward costs onto the sector. There's only so much cash reserves you have. There's only so much you can squeeze out your assets. And bearing in mind the people that we rent to are going to be the ones who are going to be disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis that we're seeing now. So rent arrears are going to go up. So the cash that we're getting in is going to decrease. The cash that we need to spend is going to need to increase. It's a tightrope. I would not want to be in any finance department of any housing association for the next 5 to 10 years because all of your business plans are basically gone out the window and you're going to have to reevaluate what are the core criticals that you need to deliver. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself into some financial sticky waters.
I can agree more with that. There's a lot of wading through the proverbial that I think a lot of people are going to have to do moving forwards. I guess that is what it is.
Yeah.
So it's been delightful to speak to you. And I've certainly learned a lot more. I'm hoping the people, the listeners have come away, with a lot more. So I guess a very general comment, although we're going to put all the links in the show notes, but if people want to contact you or get in touch with you, how would they do that?
Yeah, very vocal on Twitter. So N Goodrich Housing, which is HSG. It's N Goodrich HSG is my Twitter account. Not hard to find me. I'm kind of a landmark for Twitter. account on LinkedIn as well. So if you're looking professionally, happy to kind of speak there as well. But yeah, if you Google Neil Goodrich, it's not a common name. So you're probably going to find me, particularly if you put Neil Goodrich Housing into your search engine of choice. Yeah, I'll pop up. But yeah, just say thank you for having me along. Love talking about housing, particularly social housing. It's been a really fun, interesting experience. So yeah, thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. And as I said, I've learned an awful lot from the time with you. And I think what my biggest takeaway is that for some reason in my mind, I had that social housing and private housing were at different ends of the spectrum. But actually, from everything that we've discussed, actually, to me, it sounds like we're singing from the same hymn sheet. It's just the end result is just slightly different, which, so I've learned an awful lot from that, and I think that's key to take away. So thank you for taking the time out to explain that actually as well, Neil.
More than welcome.
We had some great feedback last time. What I would say, people listening, is please do go leave us a review, get in touch with Neil, get in touch with ourselves as well, because Neil is someone that we'd love to have on the show a lot more. So your feedback helps us to do that. So please do get in touch with us to give us your thoughts, comments, etc., etc. Until next time, Neil, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me. I'll see you on the next one.